Assalamualaikum, Amanda Maria.
Assalamualaikum, Rabia.
Welcome to Malay channel. Today we are going to react on a video how Bangladesh is secretly becoming the richest country in South Asia.
Oh, wow.
Okay, and the channel is
Casual Scholar.
Let's watch it.
Right.
On March 7, 1971, Sheikh Mujibur Rahman informally declared Bangladesh's independence from what was then known as West Pakistan. Despite calling for a peaceful resolution, these words ignited an unimaginably violent conflict in which an estimated 3 million Bangladeshis were systematically exterminated in a gruesome genocide, the scale of which had not been witnessed since the atrocities of the Second World War. By the end of the conflict, Bangladesh emerged as the newest country in the world, but it also became the poorest. The destruction wrought by war was thorough, ravaging virtually every road, every bridge, every factory, and every farm, the timing of which could hardly have come at a worse time. Just 4 months prior, Bangladesh was hammered with the most destructive tropical cyclone in recorded history, which flooded a fifth of the entire country and claimed the lives of 500,000 people. In the aftermath, a special team of inspectors from the World Bank noted that some of the cities looked like the morning after a nuclear attack. At the dawn of its independence, Bangladesh was already a shattered nation, with an average life expectancy of 26 years and a child mortality rate that exceeded 37%. On average, individuals subsisted on less than 33 cents a day, while a fifth of the population lived on less than 4. Yet even more daunting was the reality that Bangladesh, deprived of considerable natural resources, habitually subjected to catastrophic natural disasters, and haunted by perpetual and often violent political instability, seemed devoid of a clear path toward making things better. It was a widespread perception that Bangladesh was destined to be forever synonymous with poverty and suffering, earning it the unflattering label as an international basket case. But astonishingly, against all conceivable odds, the past 3 decades have seen the country achieve perhaps the most significant advancement in quality of life indicators of any place in the world ever. Life expectancy has soared by 180%, while fatalities from tropical cyclones have been reduced by a staggering 100-fold. Poverty rates have dived from 80% to less than 19%, while the child mortality rate has been cut by 92%. Its economy has emerged as one of the fastest growing in the world, with its GDP per capita once 50% less than Pakistan's, now almost 50% higher. And in 2019, it overtook even India, while harboring aspirations of reaching high-income status by 2041. But how can a nation with all the odds stacked against it improve at such a blistering pace? Is this truly another economic miracle or a mirage that will painfully wither away? Before we delve into understanding the story of Bangladesh, we need to talk about something that affects each and every one of us. Have you ever wondered why you've been receiving an uptick in spam calls or emails and seeing ads popping up that are a little more than coincidental? Well, it's unfortunately because your data is being profited on, but this is only the tip of the iceberg. Data breaches and shadow profiles are giving complete strangers access to your most sensitive information, ranging from your home address, IP information, employment history, and even your social security number. But with the help of the sponsor of this video, Incogni, you can stay protected in an ever more dangerous digital landscape. Incogni reaches out to data brokers on your behalf, requesting your personal data be removed, and deals with any objections from their side in a completely automated process. So sign up right now using my link in the description, or use code CASUALSCHOLAR at checkout for 60% off, and finally get your personal information protected. As Sheikh Mujibur Rahman returned home to his shattered nation in early 1972, having spent the duration of the Liberation War as a political prisoner, he faced a seemingly insurmountable task. As leader of the Awami League, the primary political force behind the independence movement, it was his responsibility as Prime Minister to fix Bangladesh. This entailed rapidly restoring law and order, constructing the nation's political institutions and infrastructure from the ground up, and formulating a cohesive plan for swift economic development. Yet he was to accomplish all of this with virtually non-existent resources. Adding to the complexity, the coalition force that had united against Pakistan during the war rapidly fragmented into various factions, each scrambling for control over economic assets and political power. In response to this escalating political instability, Mujibur and the AL found themselves prioritizing party loyalty over merit when appointing officials, a strategy aimed at safeguarding their precarious grip on power. Coupled with the grim reality that many of those who possessed the qualifications and expertise to work in government had been systematically eliminated during the war, the initial government grappled with a severely impaired capacity to devise and implement effective developmental policies. Nevertheless, the first issue to resolve involved determining the fate of properties and assets once owned by the former Pakistani elites. This was particularly important given that after 24 years of economic subjugation, these elites owned the vast majority of industries and businesses within the country. Seeing this as an opportunity to strengthen the power of the state, the government swiftly nationalized over 700 of these firms. Most of these were handed over to loyalists and party supporters, many of whom lacked prior industry-specific experience or knowledge. This move set the government on a course toward a socialist economic system, eventually resulting in state ownership of all banking and insurance sectors and a stunning 92% of industries across the board. The remnants of the private sector found themselves burdened with heavy regulations and import restrictions, even being subjected to profit caps. Meanwhile, foreign investment was outlawed unless partnered with the government. It didn't take long for the harsh reality to set in. This had been a massive mistake. Under poor management, the state-controlled economy faltered dramatically. After just 3 years, industrial output declined by 66% due to inefficiencies. And after forcing farmers to sell their products at artificially low prices, agricultural output, the backbone of the economy and the primary income source for a majority of the population, plummeted by 84% compared to its pre-war level. Food was becoming ever more scarce, but the situation quickly turned dire. From April to July 1974, heavy rainfall led to catastrophic floods that wiped out the nation's rice crop. The economic impact was disastrous. Inflation soared to 400%, leading to widespread hoarding and speculation, while the government's food rationing system was brought to its knees by corruption. To compound the crisis, the United States, protesting Bangladesh's continued trade with embargoed Cuba, withheld 2.2 million tons of food aid. Within just 9 months, 1.5 million people perished from starvation. The fallout from these events severely undermined Mujibur's support, fueling the formation of a wide-reaching anti-Mujibur coalition, bolstered by the military and an emerging class of capitalists. Facing this opposition, Mujibur became increasingly authoritarian. He declared a state of emergency, consolidating his power as both prime minister and president. He established his own paramilitary force, which was used to torture opposition members and intimidate the population. He abolished other political parties, banned independent press, instituted martial law, and doubled down on his bid to create a socialist state. By 1975, Bangladesh was transforming into a one-party totalitarian socialist state. But this didn't last long. In August of that same year, a violent military coup resulted in the assassination of Mujibur and his extended family. His 2 daughters studying in Europe were the only survivors. Political chaos swiftly erupted with a rapid series of coups and counter-coups. When the dust finally settled, the martial law administrator, General Ziaur Rahman, more popularly known as Zia, rose to power in 1977. Subsequently, he established the Bangladesh Nationalist Party, or BNP, and started enacting sweeping policy shifts, the most consequential of which was an emphasis he placed on attracting foreign aid. Numerous Western countries and international donors had been willing to extend significant aid to Bangladesh since its independence. However, they insisted that a precondition for this support was a pivot by Bangladesh away from socialism and toward a more liberalized economic system. Under Mujibur's leadership, the government had been reluctant to make such concessions. However, by the time Zia assumed power, the situation had worsened to such a degree that aid became a desperate necessity. To appease foreign donors, restrictions on foreign investment were lifted, the stock market was reactivated, tariffs and duties were reduced, and a slow process of selling off state-owned companies began. In doing this, Bangladesh started receiving massive amounts of foreign aid as promised, amounting to just under $1 billion in 1977, or 8% of the nation's GDP. Meanwhile, the reforms themselves started to improve the economy and most critically for agriculture, something that was of particular importance as the nation was already the most densely populated in the world. The previously vast subsidized public food system and price restrictions were dismantled, while restrictions on imports like fertilizer, mechanized irrigation equipment, and pesticides were removed. Yet the most impactful development was the introduction of high-yielding variety rice crops, which were specifically developed to resist disease, shorten the growth cycle, and increase the caloric output per acre. Farmers were now able to produce more food on the same plots of land and were even able to start growing in the winter. As a result of these developments, despite a 10% reduction in the use of land, agricultural output tripled from 1971 to 2010, ensuring Bangladesh did not suffer another famine after 1974. Despite these initial successes, in which the economy doubled in size in less than 5 years, Zia decided against reforming the economy further. Combined with a fall in foreign aid and a series of poor harvests, by the early 1980s, economic growth slowed significantly. Coupled with Zia's efforts to depoliticize the military, a sense of uncertainty and stagnation began to grow, ultimately triggering 21 new coup attempts, the last of which successfully took out Zia. Bangladesh was once again thrust into political chaos. After a final bloodless military coup, Army Chief of Staff Hussein Mohammad Ershad took control of the country in 1983. In his effort to avoid ending up like Zia, Ershad solidified his power through an increase in authoritarian measures. He outlawed unions and rival political parties, disbanded the constitution, and reinstated martial law. Despite his promises to transition the country into a democracy, he consistently deferred elections and manipulated referendums to his advantage. However, Ershad reignited the economic reform process that had begun under Zia. The rest of the Mujibur-era restrictions on the private sector were eliminated. A much larger portion of the state-owned industries were transitioned into private ownership, and businesses were now allowed to compete in banking, insurance, and other financial sectors. Yet the largest endeavor was a coordinated effort to stimulate export-oriented economic growth, inspired by the then recent successes of Hong Kong, Singapore, South Korea, and Taiwan. This was initiated with the establishment of an export processing zone in the country's southeast. Within this 450-acre zone, companies are allowed to import machinery, equipment, and manufacturing materials tax-free, so long as they are strictly used in the production of goods for export. This was complemented with the introduction of back-to-back letters of credit, which essentially is a financial tool used to decrease the risk for foreign companies selling machinery and equipment to Bangladeshi business owners, something that had previously plagued industrial expansion. Yet strangely, for all these expansive economic reforms, the most important development that occurred under the Ershad government was what it decided not to do. Ever since Bangladesh emerged as one of the poorest and least developed countries on Earth, it became a magnet for non-government organizations or NGOs, many of which were homegrown in the aftermath of the Independence War. While there was government cooperation with these NGOs prior, Ershad expressed a profound level of openness with them, enabling them to provide everything from educational and financial services to healthcare and family planning. This, however, is unusual. Typically, countries suffering from political instability, and especially those headed by military regimes, are reluctant to let NGOs take over such basic services because traditionally these services are tools used by the government to ensure public support. Allowing non-state actors to take over is often feared to weaken the government's legitimacy and thus threatens the power of those in charge. Yet Bangladesh's government at the time was just too weak to provide all necessary services, and any attempt to raise taxes was seen as a more politically costly maneuver. Therefore, Ershad allowed NGOs to operate untethered, and soon after, Bangladesh became a so-called laboratory for new experimental poverty-reducing initiatives, and two NGOs in particular would change the nation forever. In 1976, university economics professor Muhammad Yunus closely observed the abject poverty experienced in the small village of Jobra near his home. In his studies, he found that one of the biggest hurdles that people faced in the community was a lack of access to money to which they could use to improve their productive capabilities. But the nation's financial sector was weak, and banks either refused to give the poor small loans or exploited them with outrageous interest rates. After experimenting with different methods of loaning his own money, Yunus pioneered the modern idea of microcredit. Poor rural residents were asked to form groups of 5 and were each given tiny loans without the need for collateral. They were then guided to use the loans to buy productive assets
The
like
water is
cattle,
so black,
improved
that's
farming
amazing.
equipment, or to start small
It's falling in
businesses.
the water.
Meanwhile, group
It's
members were
scary,
responsible
cannot
for
see
supporting each
anything.
other during repayment difficulties, as any default by an individual jeopardized the entire group's access to future credit. This simple method had stunning efficiency, with 97% of loans being fully paid back. By the early 1980s, this system had gone nationwide, with Yunus founding the NGO Grameen Bank in collaboration with the Ershad government and utilizing international donor capital. While there were other external factors at play, in areas where Grameen Bank became operational, the rate of extreme poverty reduced from 75% to 48%. And over a few decades, borrowers saw their incomes rise 43% higher than those that did not participate. Another NGO, the Bangladesh Rural Advancement Committee, known by its acronym BRAC, was founded by Bangladesh-born Shell oil executive Fazil Hassan Abed, who left his position in the UK to help those in need. BRAC got its roots building 14,000 homes for refugees and establishing desperately
good.
needed medical
Yeah.
centers following the war. Its initial success saw it quickly expand to various other avenues for alleviating poverty.
Refugees.
In response to diarrhea being the top cause of child mortality in the late 70s,
every
BRAC trained
country
members to
there's-
teach mothers to
there's
prepare oral rehydration
refugees.
solutions.
Refugees.
Over a
Them
decade,
or
they reached 12 million
refugee
homes
people.
across 75,000 villages, reducing
There's some
diarrhea-related
countries
child deaths by
still
90%. BRAC also became
Yeah,
a
yeah,
key
this
player
one,
in the
yeah.
distribution of microcredit, aimed specifically at impoverished women who faced extreme cultural discrimination in the country. In their efforts, they found that by giving the female heads of households access to money, a far greater percentage of that money was spent on improving the education and health of children. This program also helped pave the way for greater acceptance of women in the economy, which would have a huge positive implication later on. Meanwhile, BRAC, other NGOs, and the government spearheaded an extensive family planning campaign to curtail the soaring birth rates, bringing it down from nearly 7 births per woman in the 70s to just 2 today. Through further efforts in establishing
Increase.
everything from primary schools,
But the
medical
population
clinics, and
increased.
hospitals, NGOs have drastically improved productivity, safety, health, and education among the country's poorest.
good, I
And this
guess.
progress can be
If the
largely
pop-
attributed
if the
to the
bus-
substantial growth of NGOs during the Ershad
lesser than
administration.
before.
Yet, by the year
it was-
1990, Ershad's grip on
Because the
power was
population
starting to
already high.
wane as he continued to pass
Sinabi mo.
controversial legislation and rigged elections to his advantage. Mass, broad-based demonstrations, strikes, and protests started to appear regularly, while the heads of the two major parties, the BNP and AL, started to provide tangible democratic alternatives to the current system. By November, the protests had become so large and disruptive that they were able to successfully persuade the military to withdraw its backing from Ershad, subsequently forcing him to step down from power on December 6, 1990. Bangladesh was now to transition into a functioning parliamentary democracy, or at least was hoped to. Under the oversight of a neutral caretaker government A generally
That is a
perceived
trend,
free and
right?
fair election placed the BNP into a
Doesn't
slight
looks like a
majority
trend.
with Khalida Zia, General Zia's widow, as prime minister. Under BNP leadership, Bangladesh continued its trend of economic liberalization. This involved incentivizing foreign investors by allowing them to fully own industrial firms. In tandem, restrictions on currency exchange were removed, and labor laws underwent simplification to make hiring easier. Meanwhile, 7 new export processing zones were opened, in the hopes of finally spurring on sustained export-oriented growth. But with no significant natural resources, an unskilled workforce, and limited capital for investment, what exactly do you export? Drawing inspiration from the rapid development of Asian economies like Korea, China, and Vietnam, Bangladesh identified garments as the shared starting point for their success. By the 1990s, conditions were ripe for Bangladesh to continue this trend, a process that had actually begun decades earlier. A mere 2 years after
Crazy.
Bangladesh's independence, developed nations began protecting their own garment industries, which were facing stiff competition due to the influx of cheap imports from Asia. To remedy this, they created the multi-fiber arrangement, which established stringent import quotas on each of the major garment-producing countries. Yet this inadvertently provided an opportunity for Bangladesh. Manufacturers hampered by these quotas discovered a loophole. They could bypass the restrictions by setting up factories in countries lacking substantial garment industries already. South Korean corporation Daewoo seized this opportunity, partnering with Desh Ltd to create a production base in Bangladesh. This move was further incentivized by Bangladesh's status as a least developed country, granting it preferential duty-free trade with developed markets. In the late 1970s, Desh dispatched 130 employees to South Korea to undergo an 8-month intensive training course covering sewing techniques, factory management, and international marketing. However, these plans backfired when almost all trained employees left to establish their own garment businesses. Despite this, the industry in Bangladesh was initially slow to grow, as restrictive business conditions and economic policies stifled rapid expansion. However, with the reforms under Zia and then Ershad, and the use of back-to-back letters of credit and the creation and expansion of economic processing zones, garment exports began to rise by the late 1980s. But then, with the relative stability under a new democratic system, combined with other competing nations maturing to more complex industries, Bangladesh was now the new ideal location for garment manufacturing. In Bangladesh, it was just cheaper to rent warehouses, cheaper to employ labor as its wages were among the lowest in the world, and coupled with its massive population, it was just easier to find endless pools of workers to fill new factories. As a result, the garment industry started booming dramatically, and importantly, it was hiring mainly poor women, composing some 90% of the industry's workforce, which not only boosted overall employment, but also specifically increased poor family incomes. Between 1990 and 2021, the value the industry generated skyrocketed from $640 million to over $34.2 billion, accounting for 81% of the nation's exports and making Bangladesh home to the second largest garment industry in the world, only trailing behind China. This crucially started bringing in foreign currency, which was supercharged by another simultaneous development. Following increased economic globalization in the 80s and 90s, the international demand for labor increased significantly, and this gave opportunities for Bangladeshi workers to find employment in other countries and sending the money back home to their families. While these workers went to a variety of different countries, most went to Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and other Gulf states. The total revenue they sent back grew from $778 million in 1990 to $10.8 billion in 2010. The combined revenue from garment exports and migrant labor turned Bangladesh's historic trade deficit to a surplus, decreased the nation's dependence on foreign aid, and allowed the government to invest more heavily in education, energy projects, and transportation infrastructure, including the Bangabandhu and Padma bridges, which finally connected all the major sections of the country. Along with the continued work of NGOs, this generated a stunning positive economic feedback loop. From 1990 to 2020, the economy averaged a GDP growth rate of 5.6%, making it one of the fastest growing economies in the world and allowing it to surpass both Pakistan and India in GDP per capita. Bangladesh today looks almost nothing like it did when it gained independence. Nearly every significant indicator of quality of life has drastically improved, from child mortality, life expectancy, GDP per capita, poverty rates, educational enrollment, and literacy rates. What has happened in Bangladesh in the last 50 years is nothing short of a miracle, and this miracle does not appear to be slowing. While the pandemic and geopolitical conflicts temporarily set the nation back, it is already bouncing back and is projected to return to rapid growth. Meanwhile, the previous efforts to decrease fertility rates means Bangladesh is now currently benefiting from a demographic dividend, in which today more than 50% of the population is working. And as the government plans to continue investing in human capital and infrastructure, Bangladesh seems poised to continue bringing millions out of poverty and achieve its plans of becoming a high-income country by 2041. Yet beneath these indicators lies an assortment of vulnerabilities that threaten to stifle all this progress. To start, despite its best efforts, Bangladesh is struggling to diversify its economy away from garments, in which it has become way too reliant upon. Today, garments account for 10% of its economy and 81% of its exports. Yet, as the country grows, it is projected to no longer be classified as a least developed country by 2026. Meaning it will no longer receive preferential trade with rich nations. This in turn is giving other nations like Cambodia and Ethiopia the chance to steal away some of its market share. To make matters worse, Bangladesh's competitive advantage in garments is now solely as a result of its very low wages, meaning the garment industry does not provide a good path toward increasing income levels further, and in fact pose a threat to the whole nation should the industry decline. At the same time, Bangladesh has been in the midst of a gargantuan and unplanned urbanization. In just 30 years, over 44 million people have migrated from the countryside to the major cities. It has proved impossible for the nation to build homes, hospitals, highways, and other basic services at a fast enough rate to satisfy this incredible demand. This has led to the growth of sprawling slums that are contributing to poverty, inequality, and pollution. Yet this is only set to worsen, as an additional 45 million are projected to move to the already crowded cities by 2050. But scarier still is the fact that Bangladesh is one of the most vulnerable nations in the world to climate change. Nearly 75% of the nation sits below sea level, and coupled with its high population density and reliance on agriculture, weather-related events cause $1 billion in damage every year. By 2050, this is set to increase to $3 billion annually, with potentially 19 million people being displaced due to increased storm intensity and flooding. All of these issues are substantial threats to Bangladesh's future. Yet with strategic planning and the implementation of appropriate policies, they can be overcome. However, there exists an issue that outstrips all the others combined. This concern is not merely an external circumstance, but rather is intertwined with the very fabric of the nation. The issue is its government structure and its politics. Since its very inception, the country has been subject to weak government institutions, an overbearing military that continues to intervene in politics, and authoritarian leaders that abuse their power. Each of these have been supported by corruption that exists at every level of the society and the economy. Fundamentally, Bangladesh is built on a system of patron-client relations. Those with power provide protection, employment, or other benefits to less powerful individuals in return for support, loyalty, or services. At the top, government officials maintain their power by gaining the support of various and powerful interest groups. They do this by doling out legal protections, giving public loans that are never expected to be paid back, and handing out lucrative government contracts. To make this possible, there exists no meaningful mechanism to enforce government transparency or accountability. Meanwhile, a non-independent justice system not only protects corrupt officials from prosecution, but is also weaponized to attack political opponents. Today, Bangladesh ranks 147th on the Corruption Perception Index, only slightly better than Taliban-controlled Afghanistan. This has dramatic implications for the economy and specifically the poor. Extortion, bribes, and unofficial fees are a part of everyday life and include everything from applying to become a primary school teacher, getting out of unfair traffic tickets, and getting access to welfare and subsidies. Businessmen looking to enter a new market are subject to mountains of pointless red tape, have difficulties acquiring loans unless they are politically well connected, and they must bribe officials to get basic permits. All of this is exacerbated by shaky legal contract enforcement, weak property rights, and inadequate law enforcement, all combining to rank Bangladesh in 168th place for ease of doing business. Thus, foreign investment remains painfully low, at one of the lowest levels as a percentage of GDP of any Asian country. This partially explains the nation's difficulties in diversifying away from garments and into more profitable industries. Yet all of this is worsening under current Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina, who is one of the two surviving daughters of Sheikh Mujibur Rahman. While Mujibur was ultimately assassinated for trying to create a one-party state, Hasina is actively fulfilling her father's aspiration. Utilizing the AL's power over the court system and the police, she had her main rival Khalida Zia arrested in 2015 and banned from politics. In 2018, the Digital Security Act was passed, ostensibly to curb religious radicalism. Yet, it has been used to arrest and silence those who speak out against the government online. Meanwhile, the use of a neutral caretaker government to ensure fair elections has been done away with. While Bangladesh has experienced astounding increases in quality of life, this has largely been spearheaded by NGOs that were only allowed to operate so freely because the government was too weak to provide basic services. The economy has experienced explosive growth due to economic reforms that have opened the economy, yet they were initiated as a result of international donor pressure. While the government has made some key investments and correct policy choices, Bangladesh's recent success is largely not due to the government, but in spite of it. As NGOs are slowly boxed out by the government and international aid continues to be less important, it is hard to see the government continuing to make the right choices when it seems preoccupied with keeping power and maintaining institutions that perpetuate corruption. Nevertheless, through its stunning development thus far, Bangladesh has proved to the world that it's not a basket case anymore. Don't forget to check out Incogni today. Just click the link in my description and finally get your personal information protected.
Okay. This documentary is long, 30 minutes, and there's no subtitle. I know he's talking in English, but I still need subtitle to listen what he's talking about, so I can understand about the corrupt, and I can understand this government industry help Bangladesh to grow faster, the GDP rate faster. Okay, that's all for our video today. Thank you so much to those who recommend this video. If you like this video, please share it to your family members and friends. Don't forget to share it to your social media as well. Please subscribe our channel, Malay Richest, and turn on notification button so you guys won't miss our latest video. Please follow our social media account, Facebook and TikTok, Malay Richest. Thank you so much. See you again in the next video. Bye. Assalamualaikum.